Some places were meant to stay hidden. One man finds something that was never meant to be seen. Stay until the end. Subscribe and like the video. Ethan Walker arrived in the settlement on a gray morning, when the fog still clung to the trees and the road looked like it hadn't been used in days. The place barely deserved to be called a town. A single main street, a few wooden houses spaced far apart, an old gas station, and a small general store were all that broke the line between forest and sky. The silence struck him first, not the peaceful kind, but the heavy kind, as if sound itself avoided this place. He parked in front of the small house he had bought almost without seeing it, turned off the engine, and sat there for a moment longer than necessary, listening to nothing. The house stood near the edge of the forest, close enough that branches brushed the roof when the wind picked up. It was old, but solid, built decades ago by hands that knew how to prepare for long winters. Ethan unloaded his few belongings without hurry. He had learned not to rush anything anymore. Inside, the house smelled of dust, wood, and something faintly metallic, maybe from old tools left behind. He opened the windows, letting cold forest air fill the rooms, and for the first time in months, he felt that his chest wasn't tight. He had not moved here for a fresh start, at least not the hopeful kind. He came because there was nowhere else he wanted to be. The city had become unbearable, every street corner echoing with memories he couldn't silence. Here, no one knew his name, his past, or the reasons he avoided eye contact. That was exactly what he wanted. Later that day, he walked into the general store to buy food. The bell above the door rang sharply, too loud for the small space. A few locals turned their heads to look at him, their eyes lingering just a second longer than polite curiosity allowed. The store owner nodded without smiling. "You new here?" "Too," the man asked, scanning items with slow, deliberate movements. "Yes," Ethan answered. "Just moved in." There was a pause, the kind that made Ethan aware of his own breathing. "You planning to stay long?" the man asked. "I don't know," Ethan said truthfully. That seemed to satisfy no one and everyone at the same time. No further questions followed. When Ethan mentioned that his house was near the forest, one of the men standing by the counter shifted his weight and looked away. The change was subtle, but Ethan noticed it. He always noticed small things. Outside, the forest stretched endlessly, dark and dense, pressing close to the settlement as if trying to reclaim it. Beyond the tree line, a tall rock formation rose sharply from the ground, a massive cliff that looked out of place among the trees. Its surface was rough, almost black in places, and it loomed over the area like a silent observer. Ethan found his gaze returning to it more than once. That night, sleep came in fragments. Images surfaced uninvited, as they often did. His younger brother's face frozen in a moment of shock, the sound of a gunshot echoing in a narrow alley, police lights flashing against brick walls. The weapon in a stranger's hand, illegal, unregistered, and never traced back to anyone who would face consequences. Ethan woke up before dawn, his heart racing, his hands clenched into fists. In the morning, he decided to walk. The forest paths were narrow but visible, used often enough to avoid complete overgrowth. As he moved deeper among the trees, the air grew colder and heavier. The cliff appeared again through the branches, closer now, its base hidden in shadow. Ethan felt a strange pull toward it. Not curiosity exactly, but something quieter and more persistent. He remembered the look on the old man's face in the store when the forest was mentioned. The way conversation had died instantly. Ethan slowed his pace as he approached the cliff, studying the ground, the rocks, the uneven patterns of moss and roots. Everything looked natural at first glance, untouched. He stopped when he noticed how silent it was. No birds, no insects. Just the faint sound of wind brushing against stone. A memory surfaced without warning. His brother laughing, careless, holding a drink in one hand, trusting the world too easily. Ethan had warned him, told him to be careful, told him that not everyone followed the rules. The memory cut short, replaced by the sterile white of a hospital corridor and the sound of a doctor explaining things that no longer mattered. Ethan took a step back from the cliff, uneasy. He told himself it was just a rock formation, nothing more. Still, he stood there longer than he planned, studying the way the cliff seemed to press down on the forest floor beneath it, as if it carried weight far beyond stone. When he returned to the settlement, he noticed eyes on him again. A woman on a porch paused in her work as he passed. An older man leaned on a fence, watching silently. No one spoke. No one stopped him, but the message was clear enough. The forest, and especially the cliff, was not a place they wanted attention drawn to. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, casting long shadows across his yard, Ethan stood outside his house and looked toward the darkening forest. The cliff was barely visible now, swallowed by shadows, but he knew exactly where it stood. He told himself he didn't care. He told himself he hadn't come here to dig into the past, his own or anyone else's. Yet as night settled in and the forest grew quiet once more, a single thought refused to leave him. Whatever stood hidden at the base of that cliff had been waiting a long time, and somehow he had stepped closer to it the moment he arrived. The rain began sometime after midnight, light at first, then heavier, drumming steadily against the roof of the house. Ethan lay awake, listening. He had learned to measure nights by sound rather than time. Wind through trees, water against wood, silence between. By morning the forest felt different. The air was damp and sharp, carrying the smell of wet soil and stone. Low clouds hung above the treetops, blurring the line between ground and sky. He pulled on his jacket and stepped outside. The ground near the house was soft under his boots, darkened by rain. Puddles reflected broken pieces of the sky. Ethan hadn't planned to walk far, only enough to clear his head, but his feet carried him toward the familiar path leading into the forest. He didn't question it. He rarely questioned these quiet impulses anymore. The trail was slick. Leaves pressed flat into the mud. Water trickled down shallow grooves in the earth, reshaping the ground in small but noticeable ways. As he moved deeper among the trees, the rain eased, leaving behind a heavy stillness. That was when he noticed it. Near the base of the cliff, part of the forest floor looked disturbed. Moss had been torn loose. Stones shifted from their resting places. The pattern felt wrong. Not chaotic like storm damage, but deliberate, as if something hidden had briefly revealed itself. Ethan slowed his pace. His eyes traced the ground, carefully now, following the line where rock met soil. At first he saw nothing but shadows and damp stone. Then he noticed a narrow, dark gap between two large rocks, partially obscured by branches and clumps of earth. The opening was too straight, too evenly shaped to be natural. Someone had worked here. Someone had tried very hard to make sure no one noticed. A familiar tension settled into his chest. He took a step closer, then stopped. Instinct told him to turn around, to leave this place exactly as he had found it. The forest felt closed in around him, watching. He backed away, forcing himself to breathe evenly, and turned toward the path leading home. He made it only a few steps before stopping again. Images surfaced uninvited. His brother's hands raised in a useless gesture. The sudden, deafening sound that followed. The knowledge that the weapon responsible had been hidden once too, tucked away by someone who believed no one would ever find it. Ethan stood there, rainwater dripping from his jacket, and realized he couldn't walk away. Not this time. He returned to the gap and knelt, brushing aside wet leaves and dirt. The stones beneath were cold and solid. He tested one carefully, applying pressure. It shifted. Not easily, but enough to confirm what he already suspected. The rocks weren't part of the cliff. They had been placed there. Ethan worked slowly, methodically, moving branches and smaller stones first, clearing space without making unnecessary noise. His hands grew numb from the cold, his muscles tight with effort and restraint. The opening widened just enough to reveal darkness beyond, thick and absolute. A faint smell drifted out, something old and metallic, layered with dampness and decay. He leaned closer, listening. Nothing. No movement. No echo of animals disturbed. Just silence. The space beyond the opening sloped downward, narrow and uneven. Ethan hesitated at the threshold. Crossing it felt like stepping into a line that, once passed, couldn't be uncrossed. He stood there for a long moment, aware of how small he felt against the weight of stone above him and the years pressed into the earth. Then he stepped inside. The temperature dropped immediately. Moisture clung to the air, beating on his skin. He moved carefully, feeling his way along the rock wall, counting each step. Light from the entrance faded quickly, swallowed by the dark. When his boot struck something solid that wasn't stone, he froze. He crouched and reached out, his fingers brushing against wood. Rough, splintered in places, but unmistakably worked by human hands. A box, then another. As his eyes adjusted, shapes emerged from the darkness. Rectangular forms stacked against the rock wall, partially covered by old cloth and debris. Ethan swallowed hard. He didn't open them yet. He couldn't. Instead, he traced the surface of the nearest box with his fingertips, feeling grooves carved by time. There were markings on the lid, faint but visible. Letters and numbers burned into the wood. Military markings. Old ones. A wave of unease washed over him, heavier than fear. This wasn't a sluchina nachodka, not forgotten trash or abandoned tools. Whatever lay here had been placed with purpose, hidden with care, meant to remain unseen. He backed away slightly, his breathing loud in the enclosed space. His mind raced through possibilities, none of them comforting. Weapons, ammunition, things that should not have been left to decay in silence beneath a forest. For a moment, he considered leaving everything exactly as it was, covering the entrance again, pretending the rain had revealed nothing. The thought didn't last. He knew too well what happened when dangerous things were ignored, left for someone else to deal with. Ethan reached for the lid of the nearest box and lifted it slowly. The hinges creaked softly, the sound sharp in the quiet. Inside, wrapped in oil-darkened cloth, lay metal. Cold, precise shapes that needed no explanation. He closed the box again just as carefully, his hands trembling despite his effort to steady them. The truth settled over him with quiet certainty. This place had been built to hide something the world was never meant to see again. Ethan turned toward the entrance, light spilling faintly from outside, and began the careful process of replacing the stones and branches as best he could. When he emerged, the forest greeted him with the same indifference as before. Birds had returned. Wind moved through the leaves, but nothing felt the same. As he walked back toward his house, the weight of what he had seen followed him, pressing against every thought. He knew this was only the beginning. Whatever lay beneath that cliff had already reached into his life, and it wasn't going to let go quietly. Ethan returned to the cliff the next morning with a flashlight, a length of rope, and a quiet determination he hadn't felt in years. The forest was calm, almost inviting, as if it had already accepted his presence. He cleared the entrance again with more care this time, marking the positions of stones in his mind so he could replace them later. When he slipped inside, the darkness closed around him quickly, familiar now, but no less heavy. The beam of the flashlight cut through the black, revealing more of the space than he had seen before. The cave widened slightly beyond the entrance, forming a low chamber with uneven walls slick from moisture. The wooden crates lined one side, stacked in deliberate rows. There were more than he had first realized. The air carried the same metallic smell, stronger now, mixed with oil and rot. He opened one crate fully and peeled back the cloth. A rifle lay beneath, its metal darkened but intact, carefully cleaned and wrapped before being hidden. He recognized the design immediately, even if he didn't know the exact model. Nearby crates held pistols, ammunition packed tightly in boxes, spare parts arranged with almost obsessive order. This wasn't a careless hoard. It was a system. Ethan moved slowly from crate to crate, documenting what he saw in his mind. Everything pointed to the same conclusion. This was a cache from another era, preserved with the patience of someone who believed time itself was an enemy. He felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold stone beneath his feet. As he scanned the far end of the cave, his light caught something unexpected. A small fire pit, stones arranged in a circle. Nearby lay an old blanket, stiff with age, and several empty cans stacked neatly against the wall. Someone hadn't just hidden weapons here. Someone had lived here. The realization shifted something inside him. This wasn't only about danger anymore. It was about a man who had chosen isolation over the world beyond the forest. Ethan crouched near the fire pit and noticed faint scratches on the rock wall beside it. Writing. He adjusted the angle of the light, tracing the shallow marks with his eyes. Names. Dates. Some barely legible, others etched deeply, as if carved in moments of urgency. Near the blanket, partially hidden beneath a collapsed section of cloth, lay a thin, worn notebook. Ethan picked it up carefully. The cover was soft with age, the edges frayed. He opened it slowly, afraid the pages might crumble in his hands. The writing inside was tight and controlled, each line pressed firmly into the paper. The entries spoke of war, of long marches, of nights spent waiting for sounds that might mean death. Dates confirmed what Ethan already suspected. The writer was a veteran of the Second World War. As the pages turned, the tone shifted. Victory didn't bring relief. Returning home brought suspicion. The world had changed, and the writer no longer trusted it. The notebook spoke of fear, not loud or dramatic, but constant. Fear of being watched, fear of being disarmed. Fear that the skills learned in war would be needed again. The weapons weren't trophies. They were preparation. Ethan felt his throat tighten as he read. He recognized the pattern. Different cause, same damage. A life shaped by violence, unable to step away from it even when the fighting ended. The veteran wrote about the cave as a refuge, a place where no one could take anything from him, a place where he could be ready. Near the final pages, the writing grew uneven. Short sentences, repeated thoughts. The forest was safer than people. Silence was better than questions. There was no mention of family, no farewell. Just an insistence that this place must remain hidden. Ethan closed the notebook and sat back against the rock wall. The beam of his flashlight trembled slightly as his hand shook. He thought of his brother again, of how violence had reached into their lives without warning. He thought of the crates around him, of what could happen if someone else found them without understanding the weight they carried. Leaving the weapons here felt wrong. Taking them felt worse. He was standing in the shadow of another man's fear, decades old and still dangerous. The cave seemed to press closer, the walls narrowing with his thoughts. He spent another hour inside, making sure he hadn't missed anything. There were no signs of recent use, no fresh footprints. The veteran was gone, likely for many years. Only his preparations remained, frozen in time. When Ethan finally stepped back into the daylight, he felt as though he had crossed more than a physical boundary. The forest looked unchanged, indifferent to the history buried beneath it. He replaced the stones and branches carefully, restoring the mask as best he could. On the walk home, his decision took shape slowly, solidifying with each step. This wasn't about respecting the past or preserving a secret. It was about preventing the same mistakes from repeating. He didn't know how the settlement would react. He didn't know how he would explain what he had found, but he knew he couldn't carry this alone. By the time his house came into view, Ethan had already accepted what he needed to do. The war hidden beneath the cliff had waited long enough, and now it demanded an ending. Ethan made the call from his kitchen, standing by the window that faced the forest. His phone felt heavier than it should have. When the dispatcher answered, his voice was steady, measured, as if he were reporting a fallen tree or a broken fence. He gave directions carefully, described the cliff, the concealed entrance, the crates. He avoided details that didn't matter yet. When the call ended, he stayed where he was, listening to the quiet hum of the house. Nothing had changed. And yet, everything had. The first vehicles arrived before noon. Their engines cut through the stillness of the settlement, drawing people from their homes. Ethan stood near his porch, watching as uniformed officers spoke quietly among themselves, studying the forest line. No one looked at him directly at first, then someone did. A woman he had seen before, the one who worked on her porch, met his eyes briefly and looked away. He led the authorities to the cliff without speaking more than necessary. The forest seemed narrower with so many people moving through it, boots pressing paths deeper into the soil. When they reached the base of the rock formation, the officers paused, scanning the area. Ethan pointed out the disguised entrance. They uncovered it with practiced efficiency, exposing the dark opening once more. Inside, flashlights revealed what Ethan already knew: crates, weapons, ammunition. The quiet professionalism of the officers contrasted sharply with the weight of the discovery. Everything was photographed, catalogued, handled with care. No one reacted with surprise. That unsettled him more than shock would have. Word spread quickly. By the time the first crate was carried out, several residents had gathered at a distance. Their expressions varied. Some watched with relief, others with visible anger. An older man stepped forward, his voice low but sharp, asking why this was being disturbed now, after all these years. No one answered him directly. As the day wore on, investigators confirmed the story Ethan had pieced together. The weapons dated back to the Second World War. Records showed a veteran once lived in the area, later listed as missing. He had never truly disappeared. He had simply retreated into the forest, into stone and silence, carrying the war with him until the end of his life. By late afternoon, the cave was nearly empty. The last crate emerged slowly, carried by two men who treated it like something fragile rather than dangerous. The entrance was inspected, documented, and finally sealed. Stone and earth closed over the opening, not carefully disguised this time, but deliberately erased. The settlement grew quiet again once the vehicles left. People drifted back to their homes, conversations unfinished. Ethan walked back alone, the path familiar now in a way it hadn't been before. At his house, he sat on the steps and watched the light fade between the trees. That night, sleep came easier. Not peacefully, but without the sharp interruptions that had followed him for years. When memories surfaced, they didn't claw at him with the same force. His brother's face appeared, not frozen in fear, but caught in a moment of laughter. Ethan hadn't allowed himself to remember in a long time. Days passed. The settlement returned to its routines. No one spoke openly about the cave, but glances lingered when Ethan passed. Some carried resentment, others gratitude. He accepted both without comment. He hadn't come here to be understood. One morning he walked the forest path again. The cliff stood unchanged, imposing and silent. Where the entrance had been, there was now only rough stone and packed earth, indistinguishable from the rest of the rock face. The forest had already begun to reclaim the disturbed ground. Ethan stopped and looked up at the cliff. He thought of the man who had hidden here, of the years spent waiting for a war that never returned. He thought of how fear could outlive its cause, how it could be passed down silently, shaping choices long after the fighting ended. He turned away and continued down the path, back toward his house, back toward a life that no longer felt paused. The forest closed behind him, indifferent as ever. Some wars, he understood now, didn't end with treaties or time. And they ended only when someone finally chose to bring them into the light. Some secrets don't disappear. They wait. Where are you watching from? Subscribe, and like if this story stayed with you,